What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. But now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land, while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do. But the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
You know, the motto of Prager University is, you give us 5 minutes and we'll give you a semester. Well, I took many semesters on the question of the Middle East conflict. I was at the Middle East Institute, in fact, at Columbia University. That's where I did my graduate work. Semester after semester discussing the Middle East conflict as if it were the most complex conflict in the world, when in fact it's probably the easiest conflict in the world to describe. It may be the hardest to solve, but it really is the easiest to describe. And really, in a nutshell, this is what it is. Israel would like to exist and recognizes the right of the Palestinians to have a state. The Palestinians, however, and many other Muslims and Arabs, do not recognize the right of a Jewish state of Israel to exist. Every poll among Palestinians shows that the majority of Palestinians want there to be no Jewish state of Israel, doesn't believe that it should exist or had any basis for being. And this has been true since 1948, when the British left and the UN established a division. Palestine will be cut in half, a Jewish half and an Arab half. The Jews accepted it, the Arabs didn't accept it, and what happened the moment it was announced? Arab armies, about 7 Arab armies, attacked the Jewish state in order to destroy it. To everybody's surprise, the little Jewish state survived, and that was pretty much it. And then it happened again in 1967 when the dictator of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, said we are now going to extinguish the Jewish state of Israel. And Jordan joined him and Syria joined him, but Israel attacked first, and so Israel survived. And that is how Israel, and only that way, came to occupy what was called the West Bank of Jordan, where many Palestinians lived, because many Palestinians lived in that part of Jordan. So the war was over in '67, and what did the Arabs do? The Arab states all went to Khartoum, Sudan, and announced no recognition, no peace, and no negotiations. The 3 famous no's. What was Israel supposed to do? Then Israel made an agreement to give the entire Sinai Peninsula, an area of land bigger than Israel, with oil, back to Egypt, because they said they would make peace with Israel. Israel gives territory back for peace, and it will always do that. But is there really a desire for peace on the part of Israel's enemies, which broadcast after broadcast on TV and radio in the Palestinian areas is about how Jews should be killed and how Allah wants Jews to be killed? That's the typical broadcast on Palestinian television. And so it's not hard to explain the Middle East dispute. One side wants the other dead. You know what the motto of Hamas is? The motto of Hamas is, we love death as much as the Jews love life. Now you tell me, how is Israel supposed to make peace when people believe what Hamas believes? Now here is one of the most important things nobody talks about. Everybody talks about a Palestinian state. Why didn't anybody talk about a Palestinian state while the Palestinians lived under Jordanian rule? Because the truth is, people started talking about a Palestinian state once the Palestinians were under Israeli rule, because it was always a way to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. And I say Jewish state because that's what it is. There are many, many Arab states, but there's only one Jewish state. It is about the size of New Jersey. In fact, Israel is the size of El Salvador. El Salvador. And yet, if a Martian came to the earth and they visited the United Nations, or they read the world's newspapers or watched world television, they would believe that the biggest problem on earth is a state the size of New Jersey and El Salvador, this state of Israel. This preoccupation with a little democratic, humane state is absolutely irrational. And here's another question to be asked. If Israel tomorrow put down its arms and said, "We will fight no more," what would happen? If the Arab countries around Israel said, "We will fight no more, we put down our arms," what would happen? In the first case, there would be an immediate destruction of the state of Israel, with mass murder of the Jews of Israel. In the second scenario I presented, where the Arabs put down their arms and said, "We just want peace," there would be peace the next Wednesday. The fact is, as I said at the outset, it is a very simple problem to describe. One side wants the other dead. And if they didn't, there would be peace. And yet, please remember this. There has never been, never in the history of the world, a state in that area, in what is called geographically Palestine, that was not Jewish. Israel is the third autonomous Jewish state to exist in that area. There was never an autonomous Arab state. There was never an autonomous Muslim state. There was never an autonomous any other state. That's the issue. Why can't a little state the size of El Salvador that calls itself Israel be allowed to exist? That, in a nutshell, is the Middle East problem. I'm Dennis Prager.